The email arrived at 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday, while I was still wearing the black dress from my father's funeral. I'd buried him 3 days earlier, had taken the bereavement leave that company policy allowed and that my direct supervisor had approved, in writing. My laptop screen glowed with an unnatural brightness in my dimly lit dining room as I read the words again, certain I had misunderstood. Ms. Peterson, this message serves as formal notification of your employment termination from Summit Edge Logistics, effective immediately. Your recent unscheduled absence has created critical workflow disruptions that have negatively impacted our client deliverables. As discussed in our performance expectations, team leaders must maintain consistent availability. Human Resources will contact you regarding final compensation and benefit information. Please return all company property to the reception desk within 48 hours. Summit Edge Logistics Management. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. I was 47 years old. I had led my logistics team at Summit Edge for 9 years. I had postponed my father's care facility visits during our last major product launch. I had answered emails from hospital waiting rooms. I had trained over 30 employees, many of whom now held senior positions throughout the company, and I had just been terminated via email for attending my father's funeral. I closed my laptop without responding. Beside it sat the half-empty cup of tea my sister had made before leaving to pick up her children from school. "You should fight this, Holly," she'd said after reading the email over my shoulder. "This is blatantly illegal." Perhaps she was right. But 2 decades in corporate logistics had taught me something valuable. Timing is everything. Fighting requires energy, and grief had already depleted mine. What I needed was clarity. My phone buzzed insistently on the table. Text messages from my team. Someone had leaked my termination to the department. Within an hour, my phone was filled with outraged messages from colleagues. By evening, my entire team had learned what happened. "This is unconscionable," said Marcus, my senior operations lead, during our video call that night. His face looked strained, the lines around his eyes more pronounced than I remembered. "We're going to HR first thing tomorrow." "Don't," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Not yet." "But Holly, they can't do this. Your leave was approved." I saw the email confirmation myself. I know. I touched the printed copy of that very approval sitting on my desk. I had already started a folder. But I need to think strategically. Corporate restructuring has been in the works for months. This might be part of something larger. "Then we need to fight it even harder," said Amelia, our data analyst. At 32, she had the righteous indignation I'd once possessed. "They're using your father's death as an excuse." "Maybe," I acknowledged. "But rushing and angry won't help. Let me handle this my way." After disconnecting, I sat alone in the silence of my apartment, the same apartment I'd chosen for its 12-minute commute to Summit Edge headquarters. 9 years of dedicated service, countless weekend hours, missed vacations, and strategic innovations that had helped the company weather 2 economic downturns. I opened my laptop again and created a new folder. Next chapter. Inside it, I saved a copy of my termination email, my approved leave request, and began a document titled Options. I worked until 2 a.m., methodically organizing my thoughts, my records, and my plans. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply worked. Because that's what I'd always done. But this time, I was working for myself. The next morning, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. It was Diane Harrison, VP of Operations at Vertex Transport Systems, Summit Edge's main competitor. "Holly, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time," she began, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of an executive making a sensitive call. "I heard about your father's passing. Please accept my condolences." "Thank you, Diane," I replied, wondering how she'd gotten my personal number and what she really wanted. "I also heard about your situation at Summit Edge," she continued. "News travels fast in our industry. I've always respected your work, and I'd like to discuss potential opportunities at Vertex if you're open to conversation. I felt a flicker of something. Not quite hope, but possibility. I appreciate that, Diane. I'd be interested in talking further. Excellent. Are you available for lunch tomorrow? Somewhere discreet, of course. After setting the details, I hung up and stared out my window at the city skyline. Summit Edge's headquarters was visible in the distance, a gleaming tower of glass and steel where I'd spent nearly a decade of my life. Something shifted inside me, an understanding that what initially felt like an ending might actually be an opening. Later that afternoon, Marcus called again. "They're saying you abandoned your position," he said without preamble. "Richards is telling everyone you took unauthorized leave during a critical delivery phase." James Richards, the newly appointed COO who had been pushing for department restructuring for months. I'd had concerns about his methods since his arrival, but had kept them professional. "Is that so?" I kept my voice even. "Interesting, considering my leave was documented and approved." "We all know that. The team is furious, Holly. Morale is tanking." "How's the Henderson account transition going?" I asked, changing the subject. "To the major client we'd been preparing to onboard. It's—" He hesitated. "It's not good. Richards assigned Teresa as interim lead, but she doesn't know the client history or protocol adjustments we developed." I made some notes. "Make sure everything is documented, Marcus. Every decision, every communication. Why aren't you fighting this, Holly? You built this team. These are your systems." I paused, considering my words carefully. "Sometimes," I finally said, "the best response isn't immediate. Sometimes it's strategic." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means I'm not finished yet. Just document everything, please." That night, I opened my father's old leather briefcase, the one he'd carried through 30 years as a contract attorney. Inside was his notary stamp, retired, but still meaningful. He'd taught me to read contracts when I was still in high school. "People rarely read what they sign," he'd told me. "That's how they lose power." I pulled out my employment contract with Summit Edge and began reviewing it line by line, particularly the sections on termination, non-compete agreements, and client relationships. By midnight, I had a clear understanding of my position. By 1 a.m., I had a strategy. I slept soundly for the first time since my father's death. My lunch with Diane Harrison extended to nearly 3 hours. We moved from the restaurant to a quiet coffee shop where she outlined Vertex's interest in expanding their specialized logistics division, precisely the area where I had built my expertise at Summit Edge. "We've been watching your innovations for years," Diane admitted. "Your team consistently outperforms industry standards on shipment optimization and client retention." "Those metrics reflect a team effort," I said, maintaining professional modesty while recognizing my own contributions. "True, but teams reflect leadership." She slid a folder across the table. "This is our formal offer. The position is executive. Director of Specialized Logistics. You'd report directly to me with autonomy to build your division." The salary was 20% higher than what I'd made at Summit Edge. The benefits package was comprehensive, but what caught my attention was the hiring budget. "This would allow for a substantial team," I observed. "We're prepared to invest in the right talent," Diane replied with a meaningful look. "Whoever that might be." I understood the implication. Vertex wasn't just hiring me. They were open to bringing over members of my team. This wasn't poaching. This was opportunity. "I'd need to review this carefully," I said, closing the folder. "Of y'all. Of course. We'd like your response within 2 weeks, if possible." She paused. "I should mention that we're aware of the circumstances of your departure from Summit Edge. Our legal team has reviewed the situation and believes you have grounds for a wrongful termination suit." "I've considered that option," I said neutrally. "If you joined Vertex, we'd support whatever action you chose to take, or not take." Her meaning was clear. This was my decision, and Vertex wouldn't pressure me either way. After our meeting, I walked along the riverfront, the folder tucked securely in my bag. My phone buzzed with a message from Amelia. Richards just announced a department-wide workflow review. Everyone's being asked to document their processes for efficiency evaluation. Team is panicking. Efficiency evaluation. Corporate language for preparing for cuts. Over the next week, I maintained radio silence with Summit Edge while gathering information through my team. Every day brought new reports, Richards implementing arbitrary changes to established protocols, the Henderson account expressing confusion about shifting contact points, 3 other major clients requesting clarification on delivery timetables. Meanwhile, I meticulously prepared for my transition to Vertex. I reviewed their client roster, identified operational synergies, and drafted a preliminary organizational structure for my potential department. I also carefully documented every communication regarding my termination, creating a detailed timeline from my bereavement leave request through the termination email and subsequent internal messaging. I wasn't planning legal action, at least not yet, but I understood the value of comprehensive records. On the 10th day after my termination, Marcus called with news. "They're restricting access to your project documentation," he said, his voice lowered despite being alone in his home office. Richards claims it contains proprietary methodologies that need protection. Are these the standard operating procedures we developed for the Henderson transition? I asked. Yes, and the client-specific protocols for Westlake and Meridian. They've basically locked down everything you created over the past 3 years. I felt a strange calmness settle over me. Do you still have access to the cloud backup we created during the system migration last year? A pause. Yes, Richards doesn't know about that repository. Good. Make sure it stays updated. I hesitated before adding, and Marcus, start updating your resume. 2 days later, I formally accepted Vertex's offer. During my final meeting with Diane and the executive team, I presented my vision for the specialized logistics division, including a phased implementation strategy. I received unanimous approval to proceed. "There's something else we should discuss," I said as the meeting concluded. Several members of my former team at Summit Edge are exceptional talents. I believe they would be valuable additions to Vertex. The CEO, Robert Keller, leaned forward. "You're proposing we recruit from Summit Edge?" "I'm proposing we consider qualified candidates regardless of their current employer," I clarified. "I would never encourage anyone to breach contractual obligations. But if they're seeking new opportunities independently, I believe Vertex should consider them." "Fair enough," Keller nodded. "Provide HR with a list of recommended candidates. We'll follow standard recruitment protocols." That evening, I received a text from Amelia. Richards just announced team reorganization. Marcus demoted. Teresa promoted to permanent team lead. What should we do? I responded with a single line. Update your LinkedIn profile to open to opportunities. The next morning, I began my work at Vertex. By afternoon, 7 members of my former Summit Edge team had applied for positions at Vertex. By the end of the week, the number had grown to 12. I maintained professional distance from the hiring process, providing input only when directly asked by HR, but I ensured that each application received fair consideration based on qualifications and fit. 3 weeks into my new role, Marcus called with information that made my breath catch. "I found something," he said, his voice tense with suppressed excitement. I was archiving old projections for the handover, and I discovered discrepancies in the quarterly reports Richard submitted to the executive team. "What kind of discrepancies?" I asked, already reaching for a notepad. "The numbers don't match our actual performance metrics. He's been systematically underreporting team achievements and overreporting resource utilization. According to his data, our department has been underperforming for the past 6 months, but the raw data shows the opposite." The implications were immediately clear. He's been building a case for restructuring based on manipulated data. Exactly. And Holly? Marcus paused. The date stamps show he started altering reports 2 weeks before your father passed away. This wasn't about your bereavement leave. They were planning this before. I felt a cold certainty settle over me. Do you have documentation? I've compiled everything. Original reports, altered versions, timestamp data. It's all here. Send it to your personal email, then delete the evidence of sending it. That night, alone in my apartment, I reviewed the files Marcus had sent. The evidence was irrefutable. Richards had methodically built a case for restructuring my department by falsifying performance data. My termination hadn't been about unauthorized absence. It had been the first step in dismantling a team whose success threatened his narrative. I closed my laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. I now had enough evidence to file a wrongful termination lawsuit that would likely succeed. I could expose Richards and possibly force Summit Edge to reinstate me and my team. But as I stood there, I realized something important. I didn't want to go back. Summit Edge was no longer where I belonged. My path forward lay elsewhere. I made my decision. I would not fight to return to a company that had discarded me so callously. Instead, I would build something better. The next day, I submitted formal offer packages to 10 former Summit Edge employees who had applied to Vertex, including Marcus and Amelia. All 10 positions had been approved by HR and the executive team based on qualifications and department needs. Then I waited. 1 month after my transition to Vertex, the exodus began. First Amelia, then Marcus, then 8 more team members submitted their resignations to Summit Edge within a 2-week period. Each followed proper protocol, giving appropriate notice and completing knowledge transfers as required by their contracts. I maintained professional distance, never directly communicating with them about their decisions until after they had formally resigned. When they joined Vertex, I welcomed them as valued colleagues, not as refugees from a sinking ship. Rumors began circulating through industry channels. Summit Edge was struggling with client retention. The Henderson account, worth over $4 million annually, was reviewing their contract. Workflow disruptions had caused delivery delays across multiple projects. 6 weeks after I joined Vertex, James Richards reached out via LinkedIn with a message that was both surprising and entirely predictable. Holly, I hope this message finds you well. I'd like to discuss the recent staffing transitions and explore potential resolutions that would benefit all parties. Perhaps we could meet for coffee next week? Regards, James. I did not respond. 3 days later, I received an email from Summit Edge's CEO, Walter Graves. Dear Ms. Peterson, I'm reaching out personally regarding the unfortunate circumstances of your departure from Summit Edge. After reviewing the situation, I believe there may have been a miscommunication regarding our bereavement leave policies and your specific situation. I would value the opportunity to discuss this matter directly with you, with the goal of finding an amicable resolution. Summit Edge has always prided itself on treating employees with respect and dignity, and I want to ensure we uphold those values. Please let me know when you might be available for a conversation. Sincerely, Walter Graves, CEO Summit Edge Logistics. Forwarded the email to my personal attorney, a colleague of my father's who had offered his services pro bono after hearing about my termination. His response came within the hour. This is essentially an admission of wrongdoing without explicitly stating it. They're worried about legal action. How do you want to proceed? I considered my options carefully. By this point, Vertex was thriving. My specialized logistics division had already secured 2 major new clients, partially due to the seamless integration of my former team members. We were projected to exceed quarterly targets by 15%. I want to meet with him, I told my attorney during our call that afternoon, not for reconciliation, but for closure. Are you sure that's wise? He asked. Anything you say could impact potential litigation. I'm not planning to file a lawsuit, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I want something different. We scheduled the meeting at a neutral location, a conference room at my attorney's office building. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a charcoal suit that I'd purchased with my first Vertex paycheck. I felt calm, centered, and completely clear about my purpose. Walter Graves arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a woman I recognized as Summit Edge's general counsel. My attorney greeted them professionally, established ground rules for the meeting, and then we began. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Holly," Graves began, using my first name as though we were still colleagues. "I want to personally express my regret about how your departure from Summit Edge was handled. It wasn't consistent with our company values or with your years of dedicated service." I nodded, but didn't speak. "We would like to discuss options for making this right," he continued when I didn't respond, "including the possibility of reinstatement, with appropriate compensation for lost wages or a consulting arrangement that would help smooth the current transition challenges." "You mean the challenges created when almost my entire team resigned within 2 weeks?" I asked, my voice even. He shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, that situation has created some operational difficulties that we're working to address." "I'm not interested in returning to Summit Edge, Mr. Graves," I said. "Nor am I interested in consulting arrangements. I'm building something new at Vertex." "I understand your reluctance," he said, leaning forward. "But I hope you'll consider that mistakes were made at a middle management level, not as company policy. We value the contributions you made over your years with us." "Is that why you allowed James Richards to falsify departmental performance data to justify restructuring? Because you valued my contributions?" The room went silent. The general counsel straightened in her chair. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Graves said carefully. I opened my portfolio and removed a bound document, sliding it across the table. "This is a comprehensive analysis of the performance data manipulation that occurred in the 3 months prior to my termination. Original reports, altered versions submitted to executive leadership, and timestamp metadata showing when and by whom the changes were made." The general counsel reached for the document, but I placed my hand on it. "This is for informational purposes only. I have no intention of filing a wrongful termination lawsuit or pursuing public disclosure of these activities." "Then why are we here?" Graves asked, his confusion evident. "Closure," I said simply. "I wanted you to understand exactly what happened and why your company is now struggling. It wasn't because I took 3 days of approved bereavement leave to bury my father. It was because you allowed a toxic leader to dismantle a high-performing team based on manipulated data, starting with firing me while I was still in mourning." I stood up, gathering my materials. "You've lost the Henderson account, haven't you?" Graves's expression confirmed my suspicion. "They signed with Vertex last week," I informed him. "Not because I poached them. I've maintained absolute professional ethics throughout this transition, but because your company can no longer provide the service levels they require. The Meridian and Westlake accounts are likely reviewing their options as well." "What do you want, Holly?" Graves asked, his corporate facade finally cracking. "Nothing from Summit Edge," I replied honestly. "My team members made their own decisions to leave based on how they were treated after I was gone. I never solicited anyone's resignation or violated my non-compete agreement. I simply created a better workplace and let people discover it on their own." I closed my portfolio and looked directly at Graves. "I didn't come here for compensation or reinstatement. I came here so you would know exactly why your company is failing. It's not because of me, it's because of the culture that made my termination possible." With that, I walked out, my attorney following behind me. In the elevator, he looked at me with newfound respect. "That was impressive," he said. "But are you sure about not pursuing legal action? You have a strong case." "I'm sure," I replied. "Some victories don't require courtrooms. 6 months later, Vertex promoted me to Executive Vice President of Operations, with responsibility for 3 divisions, including the specialized logistics unit I had built from the ground up. My team now expanded to include not just former Summit Edge employees, but new talent we'd recruited and developed, consistently set company benchmarks for efficiency and client satisfaction. Marcus had been promoted to director, overseeing day-to-day operations of our core logistics services. Amelia now led a dedicated data analytics team that had revolutionized our forecasting capabilities. Every person who had followed me from Summit Edge had found new opportunities to grow and advance. Meanwhile, Summit Edge struggled. They'd lost 4 major accounts, including Henderson. Their stock price had dropped 17%. Industry publications ran analyses of their talent retention challenges and operational restructuring difficulties. 3 months after our meeting, Walter Graves announced his early retirement. 1 month after that, James Richards quietly left the company. I took no pleasure in their difficulties. Business wasn't personal. It was about building systems that worked, treating people with respect, and delivering value. Summit Edge had failed on all counts, not because of my actions, but because of their own. On the 1-year anniversary of my father's funeral, I visited his grave alone. The polished granite headstone was simple but dignified, much like him. I placed fresh flowers beside it and sat on the small bench nearby. "You were right, Dad," I said quietly. "You always told me that true strength isn't about fighting every battle. It's about choosing the right ones, about building rather than destroying." The autumn breeze rustled through the cemetery trees. I didn't fight to go back to a place that didn't value me. I built something better instead, something that values people for their contributions, not just their compliance. Later that evening, I hosted a dinner at my home for my leadership team, the core group that had made the journey with me from Summit Edge to Vertex. As we shared stories and celebrated our successes, Amelia raised her glass in a toast. "To Holly," she said, "who showed us all that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting ahead." Everyone laughed and clinked glasses, but Marcus caught my eye from across the table. "It wasn't about revenge, though, was it?" he asked quietly when the others had moved on to other conversations. I considered his question carefully. "No," I finally replied. "It was about creating something worthy of our talent and dedication. The fact that it succeeded while they failed was just justice." He nodded in understanding. "I've been thinking about what you said that day, about timing being everything. You never lashed out. You never even seemed angry. You just waited and built. Sometimes the strongest response to injustice isn't an immediate reaction," I said. "It's a strategic rebuild." Later, after everyone had gone, I stood on my balcony looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, the Summit Edge building stood with darkened windows and diminished prospects. And here I was, surrounded by colleagues who had become friends, leading a thriving division at a company that recognized our value. I hadn't needed to destroy Summit Edge. They had done that themselves by undervaluing the people who created their success. My victory wasn't in their downfall. It was in our rise. The termination email that had arrived on that dark day a year ago had felt like an ending. Instead, it had been the beginning of something far better than I could have imagined. Not because I had fought against the injustice, but because I had used it as a foundation to build something stronger. I hadn't needed the last word. My success, our success, spoke volumes more than any confrontation ever could. And in that quiet realization, I found my peace.